Hi friends, this is Yukimi and welcome back to the Zainichi Music Project podcast. In the last episode, Foreigners Overnight, we talked about what happened to Koreans in Japan after World War II. People who had been treated as Japanese subjects under the empire suddenly lost their Japanese nationality. Overnight, they became foreigners in the country where many of them had been born and raised. That episode was part of a series inspired by the writing of sociologist John Lee. My plan has been to work through his article, one subject at a time, and I am still going to do that. But today, I want to take a small detour. As I continued reading and researching, I kept coming back across the Great Kantō Earthquake of 1923. Now, you may be wondering, what does an earthquake have to do with Zainichi Koreans? Well, that is exactly what we're going to talk about today, because after the earthquake, false rumors about Koreans spread throughout the devastated region. Those rumors led to mass violence. So today's episode is called When Rumor Became Massacre, Koreans and the Great Kantō Earthquake. Before we begin, I just want to give you a quick update about the Zainichi Music Project. I started this project last August because I wanted to understand and reclaim a history that had often been hidden from me. I'm a third-generation Zainichi Korean, born and raised in Japan. Growing up, I knew I was different. I knew my family was Korean. I knew we used Japanese names. I knew there were parts of our identity that we did not openly discuss. But I did not understand the history behind any of it. I didn't understand how colonialism, migration, discrimination, assimilation, and generations of silence had shaped my family and the wider Zainichi community. So I started this project. I wanted to explore these histories through music, research, conversation, and storytelling. I also wanted to create space for Zainichi people to speak in our own voices. This past year has been quite an adventure, and honestly, there has been a lot of self-doubt. I have often wondered whether I am qualified to do this, whether I am getting it right, and whether anyone really cares. But something else has also happened. I've met new people. I've connected with scholars, composers, artists, universities, and cultural institutions. More people are joining the conversation, and I am very happy to tell you that the project is moving forward. I am now speaking with composers about creating new music connected to the Zainichi experience. I am continuing the research, building relationships, and discovering what this project may become. You can also read written versions of these episodes on Medium. Just search for my name, Yukimi Song, on the platform. Thank you for listening and sharing the episodes with your friends and colleagues and supporting this work. And if you would like to support the Zainichi Music Project financially, you can visit our NIFA physical sponsorship page. The link is in the show notes. Okay, let us go back to September 1st, 1923. To understand why Koreans became targets, we first need to understand how they were viewed inside the Japanese Empire. Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910. Japanese colonialism was justified through the claim that Korean society was backward and that Japan was bringing civilization, progress, and modernity. Think about the logic of that for a moment. First, the colonizing power describes another people as inferior. Then it uses that supposed inferiority to justify taking control of their country. And once colonial rule creates poverty, instability, and displacement, those conditions are used as further evidence that the colonized people were inferior all along. It is a circle. Japanese contempt for Korean culture helped justify colonization. Colonial rule then reinforced stereotypes of Koreans as poor, lazy, immoral, criminal, uncivilized, and disloyal. By 1923, many Koreans were living and working in Japan. Some came for jobs, some came for education, Others had lost their livelihoods and faced growing hardship under colonial rule. Legally, Koreans were subjects of the Japanese Empire because Korea had been annexed. But that did not make them equal. They were ruled by Japan, yet they were never fully accepted as Japanese. They were inside the empire, but still treated as outsiders. They were seen as inferior, suspicious, and potentially dangerous. And after the earthquake, that contradiction became deadly. The Great Kantō Earthquake struck shortly before noon on September 1st, 1923. Tokyo, Yokohama, and the surrounding region were devastated. Buildings collapsed, fires spread quickly, transportation and communication systems failed. Families were separated, homes disappeared, huge numbers of people were killed or displaced. People were frightened, disoriented, and desperate for information. And then the rumors began. People said Koreans were poisoning wells. They said Koreans were setting fires. They said Koreans were looting homes, attacking Japanese people, and preparing an uprising. There was no credible evidence for those claims, but the rumors spread anyway. Why? Because Japanese society had already been prepared to believe them. For years, Koreans had been portrayed as dirty, criminal, violent, and disloyal. Japanese authorities also feared Korean independence activism. Only 4 years earlier, in 1919, the March 1st movement had challenged Japanese colonial rule across Korea. Japanese authorities responded with severe repression. So by 1923, the idea that Koreans were dangerous or rebellious was already familiar. The earthquake created the panic. Colonial racism decided who would be blamed. And I have to ask, does this sound familiar? Because when a society is frightened, divided, or struggling, marginalized people often become convenient targets. We hear versions of this in our society today. Immigrants are blamed, undocumented migrants are blamed, LGBTQ plus people are blamed. Minority communities are blamed for social problems they did not create. Of course, present-day America and Imperial Japan are not the same. The historical circumstances are different, but the pattern feels familiar. First, a group is described as dangerous, immoral, criminal, or disloyal. Then those accusations are repeated and repeated and repeated. Eventually, fear begins to feel like fact. People begin to believe that attacking, excluding, or punishing that group is necessary to protect the country. That is why the rumors of 1923 still matter. They show us how prejudice becomes permission. And after the Great Kantō Earthquake, that permission became violence. Civilian vigilante groups formed throughout the devastated region. They established checkpoints and stopped people passing through neighborhoods. Anyone suspected of being Korean could be questioned, detained, beaten, or killed. Some vigilantes demanded that people pronounce certain Japanese words or phrases. They believed these words would be difficult for Korean speakers. Think about what that meant. Your accent could determine whether you lived or died. A stranger could listen to the way you spoke and decide that you did not belong. And these so-called language tests were not even reliable. Chinese residents were attacked. Okinawans were attacked. Japanese people who spoke regional dialects were sometimes mistaken for Koreans. People were killed because someone decided they sounded like Koreans, looked Korean, or behaved in a way imagined to be Korean. The violence was not limited to frightened citizens acting on their own. Research and testimony have documented killings by civilian vigilantes, police officers, and military personnel. Local officials and newspapers also helped spread or legitimize the rumors. The details varied from place to place. Some officials tried to protect Koreans, others detained them. Some authorities repeated the rumors as though they were facts. Some participated directly in the violence. So we can't explain the massacre by saying that people simply panicked. The rumors gained power because institutions gave them credibility. People believed they were defending their neighborhoods and their country from a Korean threat. But that threat was imaginary. It had been created through years of colonial propaganda. The exact death toll remains disputed. Historians generally speak of several thousand Korean victims. Approximately 6,000 is often cited in Korean in Zainichi commemorative accounts. There is no universally accepted final number. Records were incomplete. Bodies disappeared or were buried without reliable documentation. Evidence was lost. Authorities minimized the scale of the killings. And this uncertainty is part of the story. When a government fails to investigate fully, preserve evidence, or account for the dead, later generations are forced to reconstruct what happened. The absence of a final number does not make the massacre less real. It tells us how completely the victims were denied recognition, even after death. The massacre exposed the unstable position of Koreans inside Imperial Japan. Koreans were legally subjects of the empire. But during a crisis, that status offered little protection. They could suddenly be described as foreigners, criminals, rebels, and enemies. Japan claimed Korea as part of its empire while refusing to accept Koreans as equal members of the Japanese nation. Koreans were expected to obey the empire, work within it, and prove their loyalty. But they could never stop being marked as Korean. Sociologist Sonia Rang connects the massacre to the racial and linguistic boundaries of the Japanese nation. And the pronunciation tests make that boundary brutally clear. Belonging was not determined by legal status. It could be decided through accent, language, appearance, ancestry, or someone else's perception. Koreans were legally inside the empire. Socially, they remained outside the nation. The Kantō Massacre became an enduring part of Zainichi collective memory. Along with forced migration, it became one of the histories through which later generations understood the vulnerability of Koreans in Japan. This was more than a tragedy from the distant past. It shows how quickly Koreans could be turned into an internal enemy. They could live in Japan, work in Japan, and be legally governed as subjects of the Japanese empire. Yet in an amount of crisis, they could still be marked as outsiders and treated as disposable. That left a deep and lasting fear. Being visibly Korean could be dangerous. Sounding Korean could be dangerous. A national crisis could bring old hatred back to the surface. Neighbors, police officers, soldiers, and government officials could become participants in the violence. And afterward, the society responsible could minimize, deny, or simply stop talking about what had happened. For later generations of Koreans in Japan, the massacre became part of how they understood their relationship with the Japanese state and society. It also reinforced the need to preserve their own history because they could not assume that the dominant society would preserve it for them. The story did not end when the killing stopped. Zainichi Koreans and Japanese supporters worked to preserve testimony, investigate burial sites, organize memorials, and build monuments. They had to fight to keep the history alive because Japan never reached a clear national reckoning with the massacre or with the role of state institutions. And historical erasure does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like silence in a school textbook. Sometimes it looks like vague language. Sometimes it looks like an incomplete investigation. And sometimes it looks like someone saying, "We cannot know exactly what happened," and then using that uncertainty as an excuse to avoid responsibility. That is why the struggle over memory matters. The fight to preserve the history became part of the history itself. As I continue this project, I keep discovering histories that I was never taught while growing up in Japan. I knew I was Korean. I knew my family carried a history that most Japanese families around us did not. I knew we used Japanese alias names, and I knew how Koreans were often viewed in Japanese society. I had felt the weight of those attitudes myself. What I did not fully understand was where those ideas came from, how deeply they were rooted in colonial rule, and how quickly they could become deadly during a moment of fear and crisis. That is one reason I created the Zainichi Music Project. I didn't create this project because I had all the answers. I created it because I wanted to understand the history that shaped my family and community, and to explore that history through research, conversation, music, and storytelling. This podcast is one part of that larger journey. And through this work, I have realized something. When the dominant society does not preserve a community's history, the community has to preserve it. That can happen through testimony, through scholarship, through archives and memorials, through conversation, literature, art, and music. And for me, it begins with reading, listening, asking questions, and refusing to let these histories disappear. The Kantō Earthquake was a natural disaster. The massacre that followed was created by people. The earthquake destroyed cities. Colonial racism decided who would be blamed. The rumors did not create prejudice from nothing. They activated ideas that Japanese society had already accepted about Koreans, that they were inferior, criminal, disloyal, and dangerous. And this is what I keep thinking about. Mass violence begins before the first person is attacked. It begins in the stories that society tells over and over again. Stories about who belongs, who can be trusted, who is dangerous, and whose life matters. Thank you for listening. After 8 episodes focused largely on painful history, I think we are ready for a little change of pace. The next episode will also step outside the Joan Lee series. This time, we are going to talk about successful Zainichi Korean entrepreneurs. We will look at major business founders, restaurant owners, shopkeepers, manufacturers, and family businesses. Zainichi history is filled with loss and injustice, but it also contains imagination, creativity, ambition, resourcefulness, achievement, and success. So please stay tuned. You can find project updates and written versions of these episodes through the links in the show notes. And if you would like to support the continuing development of the Zainichi Music Project, please visit our NIFA fiscal sponsorship page. Of course, you can follow my project on Instagram at Zainichi Music Project. Until next time, thank you for being here and for learning this history with me.